Chapter 6, Part 2, starts on page 149 of your books. And as I said, it covers the 4-month period that the boys and their older brother spend in Menton. So it starts with quite a lovely description of how they arrive. They head down to the salon and they see Henri, who's working there. And his reaction when he sees them is just like the words that his dad used. This is on page 151. He sees them come in and he says, "Ah, voilà les voyous. Here are my little troublemakers. Here are my little hoodlums." He takes them off to see Albert in their flat, and Albert says exactly the same thing. So we've got this sense that the older brothers are very similar to the parents, but they're very, very pleased to see them. And on page 153, we've got this voice of the author, perhaps of the child as well. Nous étions tous contents, la famille se reformait. We were all very happy, the family was getting back together. The older boys tell a little bit of the story of the difficulties that they had moving to the free zone. They tell this story of how they got caught up in some checks and they'd met this man called Simon Rauschenberger, which is about as Jewish a sounding name as you could get. But he's stopped by a German soldier who asks him, is he French? And the guy replies, well, absolutely yes. And he's looking at his papers and he can't work it out. And he says, well, what religion are you? And this Rauschenberger says, well, Catholic, but be careful, I'm an Orthodox Catholic. And it's just very funny the way he's delivered this, because he clearly isn't, but his papers say he is. And in the aftermath of all this, the older boys get through all the checks quite easily. So they're all very happy to be back together. The younger boys set up a mattress in the dining room. They go shopping for the brothers, and then they have 3 days in Menton of adventure where they're just roaming around. Then on page 158, Maurice says, "Écoute, Joe, tu crois pas qu'on pourrait essayer de gagner un peu d'argent? Don't you think that we should start trying to earn a bit of money?" Because he looks around and says, it would help our brothers. They are earning, but they've only been feeding 2 of them so far, and now they need to feed 4. So we've got this real change. The boys are clearly physically still very young, but they're starting to get this adult mentality. And Joe, the author's saying, at the bottom of page 148, well, we've been looking after ourselves and we've been getting along as des enfants dans un monde d'adultes, so in this world of adults. And at the start of page 159, Joe the philosopher is saying, well, I don't really think it was a sense of duty or morals, but it had actually become a bit of a game going out to earn money. So the boys decide to go and earn some money. Maurice, we learn, gets a job in a boulangerie, and whilst they're out and about, Joe meets a character called Virgilio, and Virgilio tells him about how he went into a little village nearby and worked for this couple, Monsieur and Madame Vial. So Joe decides that he would like this job. Virgilio can't do it anymore. He's got to go back to school. And Joe heads off to this village the next day on his own, which, he's 10 years old, quite a mature thing to do. Now, the next few pages in the chapter deal with the episode in the Vial household. Monsieur and Madame Vial are a bit of an odd couple. They're really peripheral to the story. I'll explain a little bit about them, but their relevance to events is minimal. It turns out when Joe arrives on page 163 and Madame Vial opens the door to him, he can see that elle avait appartenu à la grande société parisienne. She'd been part of Parisian society. She quite clearly didn't fit in this rural village. But Joe learns through chatting to her that she'd been sent down to Menton as a young girl because she'd been suffering from TB. She spent some time there, and one day while she was out walking, she injured herself. Monsieur Vial came along, rescued her, because she'd been stuck there for a couple of hours. And that was it. They stayed together. And we learn on page 164 that this was a big scandal because he was a few years older than her. He was a free thinker, un libre penseur. And because of this scandal, her family had cut her off. So we've got this very odd society couple living in the middle of nowhere. But what Joe really realises is the point of him being there is that Madame Vial needs a companion. So he's doing little things like feeding the chickens. But on page 165, he says that his essential job would be to écouter parler la maîtresse de maison, to listen to the mistress of the house talking. But as I said, they really don't have any impact on the story. After 10 days, he decides to return home for a visit. And this is where there is a key event, because as he returns home, as he walks in, everybody stood up. And as he walks through the door, he's told that on a reçu de mauvaises nouvelles on page 169. And he learns that the parents have been arrested. They've been arrested by the Vichy police, not the Nazis in occupied France. So they managed to get across the demarcation line and they were arrested by the Vichy authorities. And Henri decides that he is going to go off to the holding camp where they're being kept to try and free them. Henri disappears for quite a period of time, almost 2 weeks. And in the meantime, the boys go back to school. And Albert's getting a bit anxious that Henri hasn't come back, and he decides that they're going to have to move on, because if the parents have been arrested as Jews and Henri is therefore arrested as their son, it wouldn't be long before they would be arrested too. So Albert sets this time limit, and just as the time's about to expire, Henri returns. And he says they're free. And he tells this really fantastical story of how he arrived at the transit camp, realised that he couldn't get in, and he started going along to the bars that the soldiers drank in. And bit by bit, he befriended one of the soldiers, offered to give him a haircut in return for getting access to the camp commander, which he eventually does. And we have, the episode is described starting on page 181, where the commander says to him, "N'oubliez pas qu'en entrant ici, vous risquez votre liberté." So don't forget that by entering here, you're risking your own freedom. And Henri starts by saying, well, I'm French, my parents are not Jewish. And he starts by playing on his patriotism. So he says, I fought in these wars, these campaigns. I was in Dunkirk, I was in Flanders, I was in the Belgian campaign. So it starts by appealing to this soldier's sense of patriotism. Then he goes on to talk about Mum. And he says, well, you can see from her papers that she's Catholic. And not only is she Catholic, her maiden name was Markov. And I defy you to find any Jewish person that is called Markov. But what's most important is that the Markov were a junior branch of the Romanov family, which had been the ruling family of Russia. So he makes up this link to the imperial family. With regards to the dad, he says, well, he really chances it here. He says, look, I'm telling you, my dad can't be Jewish because you know that all Jews have had their French nationality taken away from them, torn up. And this is a true fact, that did happen. He said, but you've got the papers saying that my dad has French nationality. So he can't be Jewish because if he were, he would have had those papers taken away from him. At this point, the commandant goes, okay, well, that's a logical argument, but I need to follow it up. So I'm going to ring the préfecture in Paris. And he does. And he's on the phone. This is described, the conversation is described on page 186, 187. And in this phone conversation, we are led to understand that the commander is told that, yes, the dad still has French nationality, therefore he cannot be Jewish. We don't ever learn what has happened on the other end of the phone, and there's quite a bit of discussion between the boys about this later on page 188. They said, you know, that the first possibility is that they've not actually got round to recording the fact that they'd taken his papers off him. It was just a delay. Or the second explanation is that whoever answered the phone actually either didn't even look for his file or found his file, saw that he was Jewish, but they're a sympathiser and said that he still had his papers. So various possibilities, and we never really learn which one it is. But the parents have been freed. They don't come back with Henri. That would be too dangerous. But they have been freed. And then at the end of this chapter, another key incident. Everyone's settled down, everyone's relieved, and there's a knock at the door one night. This is on page 193, and there are two gendarmes stood there, and they say, "Vous avez votre carte d'identité?" They're asking for their ID cards, and they hand over two orders. This is on page 194. C'est pour le STO. Now, STO stands for Service du Travail Obligatoire, which meant that the boys were being called up to be sent to work for the war effort, probably in Germany. This fact alone for a patriotic Frenchman would be very, very distasteful. Even more dangerous given that the boys are actually Jewish and hiding their identity. However, interestingly, the gendarmes have come 2 days before they have to leave. So it's almost like they've given them a warning. Perhaps these are sympathetic gendarmes. We see a real mixture of people in this novel, people who ally themselves with the Nazis and people who are discreetly working against them. So we could perhaps conclude that these gendarmes wanted to give the boys warning and allow them chance to escape. And this is exactly what they decide to do. They say, we can't stay here anymore as a family. And they decide that very night they're going to have to leave for Nice. That takes us to the end of chapter 6. A very sad ending for Joe because he's feeling once again that he's having to run away. Page 196, he says, Je reprenais la route. I was back on the road. And that I shouldn't get too attached to things. So Joe constantly having to move to stay safe. So lots happen in the second part of chapter 6. Main theme, of course, is la guerre. We've got various references to food. Sometimes there's very little of it, but actually when the boys arrive in Menton, they actually get some cheese that's got some fat in it, which is a bit novel for them. We also see, particularly in the episode where Joe's describing going back to school, page 175, he says, Mon maître se révéla être une maîtresse. So my schoolmaster was revealed to be a schoolmistress. Il faut dire que tous les hommes étaient partis à la guerre, se trouvaient pour la plupart être prisonniers. So most men had gone off to war and found themselves as prisoners. So he had a female teacher. He also talks about the biscuits that all children were given. Because it was recognised by the government that children were starting to suffer because of rationing, the Vichy government decided to give out these biscuits vitaminés, and all children were given them at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Joe also describes how the children that seemed most malnourished were also given this extra sweets. and how he wasn't entitled to this sweet, but he actually started trading his marbles with one of his school friends who was getting this every day. So various references to food and rationing. Obviously, the fact that the parents have been arrested. Excuse the dog. The fact that the parents have been arrested, the episode in the transit camp, this call up for STO, all of these are references to war. And again, this idea that they can never relax, they constantly need to be moving on. Other themes, some of these we've seen before. We've got la chance, luck. We've got the good luck, the absolute good fortune that Henri has by persuading the camp commander to free his parents. This good luck that whoever answers the phone in Paris goes along with his story or appears to. We've got le mensonge, this constant lie, very evidently shown, not by Joe for once, but by Henri, that this lie that he fabricates manages to free his parents. We've got a theme that is constant throughout the novel of the boys changing, developing, growing. So they take on this very adult responsibility of looking for work. They recognise that their older brothers probably need a bit of financial help. So we see them really starting to change from young, carefree boys into still young boys, but very, very aware of the world. We also see the strength of the familial love. They are the younger brothers and the older brothers are delighted to be reunited, and Henri very willingly walks into the lion's den to try and free his parents. So there's a really, really strong familial bond here. The last theme that we see, and this links to the theme of adventure. Some of the titles that come up about, is this just one big adventure for the boys, or is it something more serious? So we've seen Joe's imagination at play before in other parts. We see it again when they're suggesting what are the possible reasons that the parents were released. Joe comes up with this idea that perhaps after all the commander understood what was going on, but still decided to lie and free the parents. And we said on page 189, Joe saying, peut-être que c'est le colonel, maybe it was the camp commander. Maybe he knew, he was told that Dad was Jewish and that he actually said the opposite in order to be able to release them. And that the brothers are kind of saying, oh, Joe, you could make a living out of these crazy detective ideas that you come up with. So we've got this very innocent view on things linked to this idea of everything being a bit of a game, a bit of an adventure. However, at the end of this chapter, the family are separating again and they're heading off to Nice. End of chapter 6.